Douglas A. Blackman.
All right.
To enterprising industrialists who would reshape the Southern economy in the half century after the Civil War, the new concept of industrialized black labor had taken firm hold. Long before the end of the chattel slavery, Milner was in the vanguard of the new theory of industrial forced labor. In 1859, he wrote that black labor marshaled into regiment's productivity of a factory setting would be the key to the economic development of Alabama and the South. Milner believed that white people would always look upon and treat Negroes as an inferior being. Nonetheless, indeed, for the very reason, blacks would serve a highly useful purpose as the clever muse of industrial aid, provided he has an overseer, a Southern man who knows how to manage Negroes. Milner's intuition that the future of blacks in America rested on how whites choose to manage them, whether in slavery or out of it, would resonate through the next half century of national discourse about the proper role of the descendants of Africa in American life. Milner was no mere theorist. He was a dogged executor of his vision. It was men like Milner who would seize the opportunity presented by convict leasing to reclaim slavery after the destruction of the Civil War. As Alabama began selling its black prisoners in large numbers in 1870, he scrambled to acquire all that were available, plunging them by the hundreds into a hellish coal operation called Eureka Mines, later illegally selling hundreds of these new slaves in the 1880s, along with another coal mine, to Georgia Pacific Railroad Company. In every setting that Milner employed convicted slaves in the late 19th century, he and his business associates subject the workers to almost animalistic mistreatment, a revivification of the most aspect of antebellum bondage. Records of Milner's various mines and slave farmers in southern Alabama, owned by one of his business partners, a cousin to an investor in the Bibb steam mill, tell the story of black women stripped naked and whipped, of hundreds of men starved, chained, and beaten, of workers perpetually lace-ridden and barely clothed. Milner took center stage in Alabama's new industrialization, urging Southerners to go to work, eradicating the disease that are destroying us. Part of the eradication would be to successfully redeem free slaves. I am clearly of the opinion from my own observation that Negro labor can be made exceedingly profitable in rolling mills. Milner had written of these steel products in 1859. I have long since learned that Negro slaves is more reliable and cheaper for any business connected with the construction of a railroad than white. Milner and others had seen this theory of black slaves as an effective industrial force worker vividly fulfilled during the war. The system emerging with the end of Reconstruction would mimic it repeatedly. African Americans driven by the right man in the correct way could be the engineer of far more complex enterprise than the old soap planters would ever have believed possible. Black laborers might not quite be men, but the industrialists reasoned that they recognized that African American were far more than apes. The renting of slaves, as much as any, had taught them that masses of black laborers brought under the temporary control of a commercial enterprise could be powerfully leveraged and commerces. The attitude among Southern whites at the re-subjugation of African Americans was an acceptable, even essential element of solving the Negro question. Couldn't have been more explicit. The desire of white farmers to recap their former slaves through new civil law was transparent. In the immediate wake of the emancipation, the Alabama legislature swiftly passed a measure under which the orphans of free slaves or the children of black deemed inadequate parents were to be apprenticed to their former slave. The South Carolina planter Henry William Ravenel wrote in September 1865, "There must be stringent laws to control the Negro and require them to fulfill their contracts of labor on the farms." With the Southern economy in ruins, state officials limited to the barest resources, and county governments with even fewer, the concept of reintroducing the forced labor of blacks as a means of funding government services was viewed by whites as an inherently practical method of eliminating the cost of building prisons and returning blacks to their appropriate position in society. Forcing convicts to work as part of a punishment for an ostensible crime was clearly legal too. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, adopted in 1865 to formally abolish slavery, specifically prohibited involuntary servitude as a punishment for duly convicted criminals. Beginning in the late 1860s, an acceleration after the return of white political control in 1877, every southern state enacted an array of interlocking laws ostensibly intended for criminalize black life. Many such laws were struck down in court appeals or through federal interventions, but new statutes embracing the same strictures of black lives quickly appeared to replace them. Few laws specifically enunciated their applicability only to blacks, but it was widely understood that these provisions would rarely, if ever, be enforced on white. Even southern states expected Arkansas and Tennessee to pass laws by the end of 1865 outlawing vagrancy and so vaguely defining it that virtually any free slave not under the protection of a white man could be arrested for the crime. In 1865, Mississippi statutes require African American workers to enter into labor contracts with white farmers in January 1st of every year or risk arrest. Four other states legislated that African Americans could not legally be hired for work without a discharge paper from their previous employer, effectively preventing them from leaving the plantation of the white man they worked for. In the 1880s, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida enacted laws making it a criminal act for a black man to charge employers without permission. In nearly all cases, the potential penalty awaiting black men and a small number of women snared by those laws was the prospect of being sold into forced labor. Many slaves in the South and the North attempted to place their prisoners in private hands during the 18th and early 19th century. The state of Alabama was long predisposed to the idea. Rather than taking on the cost of housing and feeding prisoners itself, it experimented with turning over convicts to private wardens, during the 1840s and 1850s, but was ultimately unsatisfied with the results. The states saved some expense but gathered no revenue. Moreover, the physical abuse that came to be almost synonymous was privatized incarceration always was eventually unacceptable in an era when virtually every convict was white. The punishment of slaves for misdeed rested with their owners. Hardly a year after the end of the war in 1866, Alabama Governor Robert M. Patton, in return for a total sum of $5, leased for 6 years his state's 375 state prisoners to a company called itself Smith and McMillan. The transaction was in fact a shame, as the partnership was actually controlled by the Alabama and Cottonville Railroad. Governor Patton became president of the railroad 3 years later. Such duplicity would be endemic to convict leasing. For the next 8 years, in every southern state, the question of who controlled the fate of black prisoners, which few black men and women among armies of defenders had committed true crimes, and who was receiving the financial benefit of their enslavement, would almost always never be answered. In 1866, Texas leased 250 convicts to two railroads at the rate of $12.50 a month. In May of 1868, 4 months after Henry and Mary's wedding, the state of Georgia signed a lease under which Georgia and Alabama Railroad acquired 100 convicts, all of them blacks, for $2,500. Later that year, the state sold prisoners in the number of 134 to the Salem, Rome, and Delton Railroad, and sent 109 others to the line being constructed between the towns of Macon and Brunswick, Georgia. Arkansas began contracting out its state convicts in 1867, selling the rights to prisoners convicted of both state crime and federal offense. Mississippi turned over its 124 prisoners to the state large cotton planter Elmond Richardson. In 1868, 3 years later, the convicts were transferred to Nathan Bedford Forrest, a former Confederate general who in civilian life already was a major planter and railroad developer. In 1866, he and 5 other former rebellion officers had founded the Ku Klux Klan. Florida leased out half of the 100 prisoners in the Chattahoochee and Penitentiary in 1869. North Carolina began farming out its convicts in 1872 after white Carolinians, led by Democratic Wade Hampton, violently ousted the last black governor of the state in 1877. The legislators promptly passed a law allowing for the sale of the state's 400 blacks and 30 white prisoners. 6 years later, in 1871, Tennessee leased its nearly 800 prisoners, nearly all of them black, to Thomas O'Connor, a founding partner, along with Arthur Colyar of Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. In the 4 decades after the war, as Colyar built his company into industrial behemoth, its center of operation gradually shifted to Alabama, where it was increasingly apparent that truly vast reserves of coal and iron ore lay beneath the surface. Colyar, like Milner, was one of these prominent Southern businessmen who bridged the era of slavery and the distinct new economic opportunity of a region at the end of the 19th century. They were the true slavers, raised in the old tradition of bondage, but also men who believed that African Americans under the lash were the key to building an industrial sector in the South to defend off the growing influence of Northern capitalists. Already whites realized that the combination of trumped up legal charges and forced labor as punishment created both a desirable business proposition and an incredibly effective tool for intimidating rank and file emancipated African Americans and doing away with their most effective leaders. The newly installed white government of Hale County, deep in the majority black cotton growing sections of Alabama, began leasing prisoners to private parties in August 1875. A local grand jury said that the new practice was contributing much to the revenue of the county instead of being an expense. The money deprived from selling convicts was placed in the Fine and Fortitude Fund, which was used to pay fees to judges, sheriffs, and other law officials and witnesses who helped convict defendants. The prior year, during a violent campaign by Ku Klux Klansmen and other white reactionaries to break up black Republican political meetings across Alabama, a white raiding party confronted a meeting of African Americans in Hale County. Shots were fired in the dark and 2 men died, 1 white and 1 black. No charges were brought in the killing of the African American, but despite any evidence, they caused the shooting, leading black Republican H.R. Skinner and Woodville. Let me read that again. No charges were brought in the killing of the African American, but despite any evidence that they caused the shooting, leading black Republicans R.A. Skinner and Woodville Hardy were charged and convicted of murder. They were sent to Eureka Mines south of Birmingham in the spring of 1876. By the end of 1877, 50 convicted laborers were at work in Milner's Newcastle Coal Company mine outside Birmingham. An additional 58 men had been forced into the Eureka mine he had found near Helena. A total of 557 prisoners had been turned over that year to private corporations by the state of Alabama. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, every formerly Confederate state except Virginia had adopted the practice of leasing black prisoners into commercial hands. There were variations among states, but all shared the same basic formula. Nearly all the penal function of government were turned over to the company purchasing convict. In return for what they paid each state, the company received absolute control of the prisoners. They were ostensibly required to provide their own prisons, clothing, and food, and bore responsibility for keeping the convicts incarcerated. Company guards were empowered to chain prisoners, shooting those attempting to flee, torture any who wouldn't submit, and whip the disobedient naked or clothed without limit. Over 8 decades, almost never were there penalties pending to any acquirance of these slaves for the mistreatment or death. On paper, the regulations governing convicts' condition required that prisoners receive inadequate food, be provided with clean living quarters, and be protected from cruel and excessive punishment. At the floggings were to be recorded in the law book, and indeed hundreds were, but the only regularly enforced laws on the new slave enterprise were those designed primarily to ensure that no black workers receive freedom or experience anything other than racially segregated conditions. In Alabama, companies were fined $150 a head if they allowed a person to escape. For a time, state laws mandated that if a convict got free while being transported to the mine, the sheriff or deputy responsible had to serve out the prisoner's sentence. Ooh. Companies often face the strongest criticism for allowing blacks and white prisoners to share the same cell. White convicts and colored convicts shall not be chained together, read Alabama law. In almost every respect, the acquisition of workers, the lease arrangement, the responsibilities of the leaseholder to detain and care for them, the incentive for good behavior, leasing convicts adopted practices almost identical to those emerging in slavery in the 1850s. By the late 1870s, the defining characteristics of the new involuntary servitude were clearly apparent. It would be obsessed with ensuring disparate treatment of black, who at all times in the ensuing 50 years would constitute the vast majority of those sold into labor. They were routinely starved and brutalized by corporation farmers, government officials, and small-town businessmen intent on achieving the most lucrative balance between the productivity of captive slave laborers and the cost of sustaining them. The consequences for African Americans were grim. In the first 2 years that Alabama leased its prisoners, nearly 20 years after, 20% of them died. In the following year, mortality rose to 35%. In the fourth year, nearly 45% of African Americans were killed.